Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Rosen with Democratic Majority for Israel. I'm the communications director here. We're so happy that you've all decided to join us today. Democratic Majority for Israel is a relatively new organization, I think about 11 months old. We advocate for pro-Israel policies within the Democratic Party. We're very pleased to have you all here today. If you're interested in what you hear, if you'd like to get more involved, please do visit us on our website, DMFI.org. We're also active on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as well. So there's a lot of issues, Israel issues going on today. There's a few things we're going to talk about, and I'll preview them very quickly. The Prime Minister of Israel was indicted today. I believe it's the first time a sitting Israeli Prime Minister has been indicted. Israel came up in the presidential debate yesterday evening. We'll get to that as well. Over the past couple of weeks, there were several hundred rocket attacks fired into Israel from Gaza. There's also been some debate over potentially conditioning aid to Israel. So we're going to get to all of those things, but first I want to introduce my esteemed colleagues. Mark Mellman is President and CEO of DMFI. He's also a very well-known and respected Democratic pollster. He was a debate analyst for the Wall Street Journal and PBS. And of course, Ann Lewis, my also esteemed colleague with a very impressive career in politics. She was the White House communications director in the Clinton administration. She later served as a top advisor to Secretary Clinton. Thank you both. Mark, so what's going on with Prime Minister Netanyahu today? What impact does it have on whatever political stalemate there is?
Well, there's clearly a political stalemate. We've had both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, head of the Blue and White Party, tried to form governments, tried to get a majority in the very fractured parliament. Neither of them was able to be successful. Last night at about 8 o'clock, Gantz returned the mandate to the president to form a government, so that now the president has come back to that in a second. But this morning, this afternoon, Israel time, he was indicted by the Attorney General. It's worth noting, I think, that in the United States, the Department of Justice has a formal opinion that a sitting president cannot be indicted, and that's why Bob Mueller in his report didn't take any position on whether the president broke the law. In Israel, very different. Clearly, an incumbent sitting prime minister can be indicted because one just was. In Israel, the law is that if one who holds another ministry would have to resign. So Netanyahu does hold several other ministries, and he has to resign those positions. But you're allowed to be an indicted prime minister. That's exactly what he is. And there are 21 days now during which, according to the law, during which any member of Knesset can present a list to the president of 61 signatures. That would be a majority of the parliament, and saying we're going to form a government with the support of this majority of the parliament. Very hard to see how that imagine how that happens in the next 21 days. It could, anything can happen. But if that fails, then new elections probably in March.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Every time I feel confused by this, I like knowing I can call you and get
even more confused.
Well, get a clear answer. But we talk about Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East, and we say it so often, it sort of slides. It becomes a cliche. Stop and think for a minute what this means. That we've got a country where the prime minister gets indicted. That's, as we've said, that is more than we can do here. So yes, it is a democracy. It's a serious democracy. And those words, no one is above the law, they mean it and they live up to it. And I'm sorry it happens in this way. I wish it were a little more glorious set of circumstances, but I'm kind of proud.
We'll eagerly await to see what happens there over the next several hours and several days.
And weeks.
Weeks. Exactly. Okay, let's talk about last night's presidential primary debate. In the past, we had heard Senator Klobuchar mention Israel as a democracy and an important ally. Last night, it came up again in remarks from Senator Sanders. What was your take on that, Mark?
Well, it's interesting. Senator Sanders is usually very clear and very articulate in his responses to questions. This was a singularly unclear and inarticulate response, as far as I could tell. He was mixing a lot of different things. It wasn't clear how he intended to mix those things. But I will say, to me, the big takeaway was this. He said he was pro-Israel, which is, I think, very important. the other key takeaway is that he's talking rather naively about getting the Saudis and the Iranians in a room and presumably not having them dismember each other, but to come to some agreement. That's just not it's a rather naive vision of how foreign policy works. And he then said the same thing about Israel and the Palestinians ought to get together. It is interesting to note, I happen to have the covenant or the Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, where they say that they completely reject any, quote, rejection of any peaceful solution to the Palestinian cause, an affirmation of the jihad solution in martyrdom style is the only option. So the notion that he's going to put these people in a room and have them come to some agreement just seems to me to be, as I say, naive at best.
Yeah, I agree. When I heard him say he was going to put the Saudis and the Iranians in the room, I had this awful picture in my mind of just what that room would look like and what it would look like after just a few minutes. But I think what's interesting is that Senator Sanders thought he was saying something important about Israelis and Palestinians being treated with dignity and respect. I think we're all for that.
Absolutely.
That is not a controversial statement. That's why we're for a two-state solution, so that both Israelis can live in security and Palestinians can live respect and dignity. Yes, that's what we're for. We don't have to talk about it as, shall we say, something unusual. So I would hope as we go on, we can get used to the idea that that should be our goal.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and hit the nail on the head. Dignity, respect. I think we're all very much supportive of dignity and respect for the Palestinian people, and our organization supports a two-state solution, which means we also not only support dignity and respect, but an actual state for the Palestinians. It's how you get there that's the problem, and you have groups like those that run Gaza that are committed to a violent approach, committed to not just a Palestinian state in the area, but to the elimination of Israel. That creates more serious problems, and that's what we really have to deal with in this as we go through a negotiating period, is how to get to that end of two states.
Yes, it's not Israel and the Palestinians. As people, they can get along, but when we talk about Islamic Jihad, when we talk about Hamas and Hezbollah, these are groups that our own United States State Department says are terrorists. These are groups who govern Gaza by force and extremism and murder. I mean, we've just seen some of that recently. It's not as easy as saying, oh, if you get in a room. We do need to think about it, but the goal is absolutely right. Security for everyone, respect and dignity for both peoples, yes.
Absolutely. And I want to talk more about some of the recent attacks on Israel from Islamic Jihad. But first, I wanted to talk about aid to Israel. We've heard over the past month or so a couple of candidates talk about scenarios where they would consider conditioning aid to Israel. Can you, I guess, do a brief explainer about what U.S. aid to Israel is and why sort of cutting it would perhaps be misguided and frankly dangerous?
Right now, United States aid to Israel is in respect a 10-year memorandum of understanding that was signed by President Obama. So let's be clear. We have an ongoing relationship, President Obama, dating back to the Obama administration. May not seem very far away, but given what has changed since then, boy, it sounds like a long time ago. But there is a 10-year memorandum of understanding. I think we're in about the third year now. And it's very clear on the aid, which is the aid is going towards to help Israel defend itself by purchasing weapons, arms, that are mostly manufactured in this country, in the United States. So it both helps Israel defend itself and it supports United States manufacturing. It's a little disturbing to hear some people who I think don't understand it, don't know how it works, who think, well, we'll cut it. What would you cut? Would you cut the aid that enables Israel to defend itself? At a time when hundreds of rockets have just come down, is this the time to say, here, to show how we feel, we're going to cut back on that aid and leave you on your own? The United States and Israel are allies. We've been allies for a long time. We support one another. And I think this kind of careless talk about let's cut back on aid sends a very bad signal, Because people around the world, including in that region, say, oh, maybe that alliance isn't so secure after all.
Yes, look, I mean, the reality is very simple. As Ann said, we have a contract. The United States has a contract negotiated and signed by the Obama administration with Israel. And indeed, every Democratic member of Congress voted to make that contract law. So the Democratic Party is foursquare in favor of aid to Israel. And I should note that while a few candidates took that position, most of the presidential candidates came out and said, no, we should not be cutting back on aid. We do have this agreement. We do have this contract with Israel, this memorandum of understanding, and we should honor that. Dissing our allies, reneging on our agreements with allies, that's something that President Trump does. It's not a Democratic foreign policy. So this is just not the best way to approach the problem. The reality is that no president in the past, not President Clinton, no Democratic president, not President Obama, threatened in public to cut aid to Israel. But both President Clinton and President Obama did succeed in convincing Israel through quiet diplomacy to, for example, institute a settlement freeze. That's what some of these candidates are talking about. These presidents achieved that. They achieved it without threatening to cut aid. And threatening to cut aid is not going to move the Israelis in that direction. That's just a misunderstanding of Israeli politics. So if you want the outcome that these candidates are interested in achieving, that we're all interested in achieving, the two-state solution, cutting aid actually moves us farther away from that solution, not closer to it.
I would only add one more thing, which is, in foreign policy, as in much of life, you get what you reward. If, after the Islamic Jihad sends 400 rockets into Israel, and the result is the United States starts cutting aid, are we rewarding that kind of behavior? Or are we saying, go ahead, send lots of attacks, because they'll watch it and do more of it? Is that really what we want to incentivize?
Absolutely. And let's talk a little bit more about those most recent attacks. Israel took out Palestinian Islamic Jihad leader in a targeted killing. The response was 450 or so missiles into Israel, into highly populated areas. And let's talk about the Iron Dome and how that's funded, and really how the Iron Dome has really helped us sort of avoid seeing an even sort of wider scale war.
That's right. The Iron Dome is part of that aid, so a very important part of that aid that is in that memorandum of understanding is the Iron Dome project. This is an anti-missile system, defensive anti-missile system that was developed by Israel and is now manufactured in an important measure in the United States. So Israel's buying technology that it invented from the United States with the help of the United States. And that technology saved thousands of lives in the last week. How do we know that? Because about 90 to 95% of the rockets from Gaza that would have landed in populated zones were taken out by the Iron Dome before they landed, taken out by this anti-missile system. So truly, thousands of lives were saved over time by this system. And it does, as you said, Rachel, prevent a wider war, because, God forbid, if you had 1,000 casualties on Israel's part, no country would just sit there and absorb that. The only alternative to Iron Dome would be a ground invasion of Gaza. And if you had 1,000 casualties, or 500, or even 100 casualties in Israel as a result of these rockets, you would have had a ground invasion of Gaza. And that ground invasion of Gaza would have ended up in many more civilian deaths in Gaza, and frankly, many more civilian deaths and military deaths in Israel.
And the system of the Iron Dome, the idea that you can shoot down an incoming rocket, it's remarkable to watch. People have been thinking about it, working towards it. Israel did it, achieved it. And now we have examples of the United States military talking about buying some of this, because it can save American lives as well. So it's a great example of partnership.
And I would just say, again, going back to the aid cut discussion, if aid is cut, that's what you're cutting. That's part of what you're cutting, is Israel's ability to shoot down incoming missiles and prevent that wider war. Cutting aid actually is going to increase the number of casualties, and that's just not an answer that anybody should want to be responsible for.
It was good to hear several of the presidential candidates really condemn those attacks
Yes.
on Israel.
In fact, a number of them did. I was sort of pleased. I think we've had this before, and people were not as outspoken about it. And now, again, and I like to think that Democratic Majority for Israel has been part of this conversation because we've joined this conversation, because we talked to the candidates about what's at stake and what these rockets mean. The response has been absolutely what we would hope for. Condemn the rocket attacks, speak up for Israel's right to defend itself.
Great. So next we have a question from the community that you all have submitted. Thank you. And if there's still time to submit additional questions, if you would like. We have a question from a DMFI supporter in Plainsboro, New Jersey. How are you going to stop anti-Semitism in the Democratic Party?
Well, first, I think we have to recognize that anti-Semitism is not a Democratic Party problem. It's a problem. We see it on the Republican side. We see some of it on the Democratic side. We see it among white supremacists. We see it among extreme anti-Israel folks who also invoke and use anti-Semitic tropes. So it's a much broader problem. But the reality is most Democrats are not just opposed to anti-Semitism. Most Democrats support Israel. And we just saw evidence of this at California's Democratic Convention this last weekend. There were a series of amendments to the platform brought forward, to the California Democratic Party platform, brought forward that were truly anti-Israel. And yet they were defeated overwhelmingly by the delegates of the California Democratic Convention. And I think when you look at the fact that most of these presidential candidates were quick to condemn the rockets being fired from Gaza, as Ann said, and to back Israel's right to self-defense, when you see that Democratic delegates in California rejected these anti-Israel platform planks, I think you're seeing that at the grassroots of the Democratic Party and at the top of the Democratic Party, there is really a lot of support for Israel.
Yes, I'd say what we learned looking at this, or what reinforced, speak up. Speak up for who we are, speak up for what we believe in, speak up for what we care about. And we have found in speaking up and saying, that's wrong, that's anti-Semitic, that's wrong. Cutting aid would expose more Israeli lives. Every time we have made that argument, and that is a big piece of what DMFI does, when we make that argument in the political sphere to other Democrats, they understand and they agree and they join us.
And you can help us make that argument, both by signing up on our website, as Rachel said, and also if you care to make a donation, that really does help us carry out this work, make sure that we're able to put organizers on the ground in places like California, Iowa, New Hampshire, places that we have folks on the ground really working at the grassroots to make sure the Democratic Party maintains its strong pro-Israel tradition.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we're ready to wrap up. Ann Lewis, thank you so much, as always, for joining us again. Mark, always a pleasure to work with you. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, please visit us on our website, dmfi.org. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As Mark said, if you'd like to pitch in, we'd be grateful in any way. Thank you again. I'm Rachel Rosen, and we will talk with you all soon.
Thanks.